In many places, the church owned more property than the monarch and levied taxes of their own on destitute serfs, often substantially more hefty than other landlords. As money for fortresses and cathedrals began to dry up, strange and creative practices were being approved by bishops to raise funds for continued building and to encourage the pilgrim tourist trade, from the selling of indulgences in a cash for forgiveness service to a trade in relics and miracles that would look entirely at home in a Monty Python sketch or a Disney theme park. Ordinary people living in abject poverty were being fleeced, while they watched their spiritual leaders continue to live a life of high debauchery and excess that seemed entirely at odds with the sermons they were preaching every Sunday. Factions within the clergy also vied with one another for territorial expansion and influence, as competing monastic orders became micro-regimes in their own right, operating outside the jurisdiction of the crown and answerable only to the Pope, issuing laws and taxes of their own upon an increasingly emaciated population. Gradually, murmurings began to surface against the lifestyle of the bishops, not just from the commoners, but also from poor parish priests who spent their days ministering to the growing number of sick and infirm, as well as burying increasing numbers of malnourished children. Universities, which were the centres of philosophy, discourse and debate, became both an incubator of dissenting thought as well as the soapbox from which critical tracts were published, calling for reform. Universities were often bankrolled by the nobility, who secretly and sometimes openly supported dissident professors in voicing their criticisms, being only too happy to back intellectuals who accused the church of abuses and calling for its reform. These usually entailed criticism of the church as a dynastic and temporal power without justification in the Bible, its ownership of property, the selling of indulgences, simony or cash for jobs, and the existence of independent monastic orders that, in the words of English proto-reformer John Wycliffe, were nothing more than cults. Theologians like Wycliffe that enjoyed the patronage of nobles such as John of Gaunt and his nephew the King of England were agitators, chipping away at the periphery of church power while arguing for a return of ultimate control to the crown. They often walked a fine line, lobbying in support of their king, but often risking their ire and abandonment if their publications were viewed as heretical or potentially treasonous. If they could be used to manipulate a treaty or avoid the payment of papal taxes, then they received all the oxygen a royal court could give them. But if they became an excommunication risk, they were quickly handed over to church authorities who dealt with them in the usual manner, burning both their books and the authors at the stake. Nobody expected reformers to have much of an impact upon the broader fabric of society that still remained in the iron grip of church and state. Until 1346, when the Black Death crossed into Europe. Now, an emaciated, weak and vulnerable population, having barely survived decades of famine, war and starvation, found itself struck by a horrific plague that spread swiftly and silently throughout the entire continent, wiping out entire towns and cities in a painful, indiscriminate and grotesque pandemic that was literally of biblical proportions. Upwards of half the population of Europe perished within a couple of years. Ordinary people, already viewing the ongoing famine as some kind of divine punishment, now began to wonder if the prophesied end of the world was unfolding. Many assumed a correlation between the state of their world and the church, which had been politically fragmented since the kidnapping by King Philip IV of France of Pope Boniface VIII in 1303. Itinerant preachers, encouraged by Wycliffe and his Lollard followers to travel the countryside and preach the gospel to illiterate peasants in their native language, were viewed as heroes among the people, but as enemies of a church that was now being put under increasing pressure from all sides for reform, in a medieval glasnost that ended up having the same kind of ultimate consequences. Professors became increasingly bold and condemning, using the Church's own tactics of superstition against them, calling it first only for its reform and later for its abolition altogether. The Church was having headaches of its own after repeatedly failing to lobby the French to have the Pope's court returned to Rome, appointing, with the support of the Holy Roman Emperor, a rival anti-pope to disqualify him and rule from Rome once again. The result was a political, theological, and philosophical schism that had direct consequences on European politics and led to religious turmoil for centuries to come.